So this is going to cover defending against jump attacks from your opponent. And certain characters have different options, obviously. The most common thing that you're going to think of is, hey, I want to anti-air my opponent, right? Or I want to air-to-air my opponent. And these are two important aspects of dealing with jumps. However, this is specifically going to be talking about how to interact without doing so. So this means finding ways to do things other than just block, or just parry. Option selects are a fundamental aspect of Third Strike, right? So the baseline decision making that people usually make is that they're looking to parry an attack and get the largest punish possible. So in this case, we're going to do medium fierce into EX fireball, or we're going to do medium fierce into super. You do not have access to medium fierce into DP. So this is very important to understand what options you have available depending on when you are parrying specific attacks and against what characters this is important against. So like the later that you're able to parry an attack, the less options you have available to you, but they may be closer to you, so you may be able to get medium fierce into DP. There's a lot of nuance behind the choices that you can make regardless of it's Ken, Yun, Dudley, Hugo, etc., right? Some characters have more streamlined options after their parries, and other characters have very specific choices that end up getting better depending on when you're parrying your opponent. But because this reward for getting a parry correctly in most scenarios, unless it is a safe jump, is so high, most players have their baseline decision making being that they want to parry. So this means that they're either going to parry early and then get hit by a middle or a late jump in, or they're going to parry in the middle timing and then get hit by a potential late jump in, unless they start to do an option select of parry guard, which is parry early and then block the mid, or parry mid and then block for the late. The only option that you have if you want to do a late variant is you reverse it, where you do block, parry, block. So block, parry, block. And in this scenario, you're going to attempt to block the high, parry the mid, and then block the low-hitting jumping roundhouse from Ken. So it makes reacting a little bit easier depending on if you're able to tell the distance that your opponent is going to be at and know what options they have based on how they can connect with moves. It's funny though, because this option select used by many, including high-level players, isn't the be-all end-all, because there are other situations that exist. So let's change over the recording to the earliest timing. So at this point, when Ken is doing an early jump roundhouse, he can get super off of a hit or a DP depending on the scenario, right? So this is something that they might do if they think that you are either going to be like walking back or if you're like trying to walk forward or something, and this can hit you. However, in this case, if I walk forward and I crouch, I completely go under it. So I get to punish when they land, right? Now, you'll notice that crouch is involved here, because if I'm not crouching, it will hit me. And if I crouch and I stand up at, varying points in time, I'm either going to be hit high, or in that case, I'm hit and it still looks like I'm crouching. So you have to be very specific as to how you're using crouch. However, crouch is a very important aspect to properly defending against all the choices that your opponent has. So the higher in skill level that you get, the more common this is, but it's not something that is used all the time. But it does fundamentally shape how the rock, paper, scissors can be played at a higher level, at least as far as normal jump-ins go. Because let's say that you're crouching and most of the attacks are going to whiff depending on the timing that they are hitting you, especially against smaller characters like Chun-Li, Twins, etc., or Ibuki, right? Mid to higher, height characters when they're crouching have a harder time doing this, but it is still applicable. That being said, the concept is pretty simple. You block as long as possible, and then you forward parry and either block low, you continue to block and then walk backwards, essentially. or you parry and then you jump in a specific direction, forward, backward, neutral, whatever. You can do something like this, though, where if you look at the inputs, I am parrying and then I am jump teching. And this is something that MOV and Kuroda have sort of perfected over time, and makes it a lot harder for them to actually get opened up by like empty jump throw in certain situations as well, because if you're not off the ground already, especially for characters with longer startups to their jumps, you will still potentially get your tech. The problem with this, though, is that if you do it too late, and it's not basically on the frame after, or immediately within the startup animation of your jump, then you're going to end up getting your buttons to come out, right? And it's important that you don't get your buttons to come out, obviously. You still want to be in your pre-jump frames when this happens. But that is as deep as it goes. You also have the opportunity to do something like this, where you jump back parry, or you neutral jump parry, or whatever. This is also something that's very common for players like Kuroda. And this fundamentally changes how you need to worry about your opponent's jump-ins if you can react to your opponent's jump and then crouch. So in this situation, Ken is going to be hitting at a mid-timing. So if I do parry block here, I'm going to end up blocking the second timing, right? As opposed to getting a parry on the first timing. And if I block parry block, I will be able to walk back into a range potentially where this is guaranteed to connect. Now, one of the other issues with this is that depending on what your character has for options, it limits how you can punish your opponent by being a little bit further away. So when you add in the other option select I'm talking about, where you stay crouching, and then you parry basically as late as possible, and then you make an action, then you can punish appropriately. So in this case, Ken is going to be jumping, and if I try to interact with him after he attacks me, because this is a safe jump, I cannot. But if I were to parry guard in the middle of this sort of timing, then I'm able to block it, right? So I'm able to parry the first middle timing of the last attack, and then potentially block this. But this puts him exactly where he wants to be, right? But if we're crouching, we can end up attempting to deal with the situation. And this is also why sometimes, specifically as Ken, you'll see Kens do parry into DP immediately. Because certain characters that do have safe jumps, this is an option that beats them because it still hits them while they're in the air. If I were to try to do anything else, it doesn't work. Oops. Right? So this is part of the reason why this is so important, is because a lot of those characters that want to just get in are going to force jump timings where this is really effective as far as forcing a rock, paper, scissors after the fact. So, you know, the Kens, the Dudleys, potentially the twins, all these characters that have good jump forward decisions, this is important against. And it's the same thing against, like, Urien. Because when Urien does jump-ins, you know, he can get a big combo off of, like, crouching roundhouse into tackle, into Aegis, etc., etc. Or crouching roundhouse, or crouching fierce, I should say, into EX headbutt, into fireball Aegis, or whatever, right? So, like, there's a lot of decisions that can come from a successful jump-in, but against those characters, the other important thing is that you can also attack them if you think that they're going to be doing a specific timing. So here, if I use crouching medium kick as an example, I will get hit by this, right? Unless I walk forward enough to be at a range where I am just outside of that. So using attacks to low profile is also another thing that's possible, depending on what you're doing, right? but depending on how you are setting things up and how they are jump attacking, it might still hit you, depending on what you're doing. So you have to be very careful when doing stuff like this. There is another option available though to you, and that's only against, or for certain characters I should say. Characters with very strong dashes also have another option available to them from crouch, and that is dash. Now, this is important because you can go from crouching to a dash without actually ever moving to forward by doing, or standing up I should say, by doing down, forward, forward. So I'm going down, back, down, down, forward, forward, which will allow me to dash under Ken without standing up and getting hit by his jump HK. And this is really important for all the characters that have good dashes. Shoto's, Makoto, Urien, Oro, Chun-Li, etc. Any character without a great dash here doesn't really get much from it, and it also depends on how you are looking to interact with your opponent. Because if you're trying to force a high-low situation and try to get a trip guard on your opponent, this isn't going to be guaranteed, right? You can end up doing stuff like this, where you're able to cross-cut your opponent with your DP as Ken, but this is specific to him, right? Otherwise, you're just trying to look to get out of situations and reposition however you want to. Because you can look to jump away, or you can look to walk or backdash or whatever it is that you want to do after you've successfully dashed under your opponent. So because MOV was doing things like jump tech, and he was doing things like the late parry into block, or late parry into, you know, crouching medium kick or crouching light punch or whatever in certain situations, it was sort of eye-opening for some players, but they thought that it was specific to Chun-Li because of her hurt boxes, right? Now this is important because there's certain situations where if Chun-Li is in range and still crouching, a lot of different types of jump-ins are not going to hit her, right? Because of how her hurt boxes are aligned and how low to the ground she actually is compared to some other characters. And this also works for other characters that are smaller to the ground just as efficiently. But she also has dash under with down forward forward from crouch very easily, right? So you can do it very late in the jump-in. And that's very important because it's still allowing him to go under the mid-timing jump HK. Now, if you stay as crouched for the late jump HK, or the safe jump HK from Ken, there's not really much that can be done, right? Because even if he does the late parry guard and then tries to punish, you're not going to get a punish because it's a safe jump. The only thing that you can potentially do is throw, or you can, you know, Kara throw, or something that he was known for was crouch jab super. And this is another reason why it was considered to be more Chun-Li tech, because not a lot of other characters in the game have consistent punishes to these sort of safe jump things. And while it does require a meter in order to do it, it's round altering when something like this happens. So even though MOV showcased it with Chun-Li, it still works with other characters, right? I showed it with Ken. And it obviously works in other scenarios with characters like Yun, Yang, Ibuki, characters with shorter stature. It doesn't work as well if you were to do something like Hugo, or Q, or Urien, where it's a lot harder for them to crouch specific things, because characters that can't even crouch Goki's Tatsu are going to have a harder time with this. But that being said, because their character has a larger hurt box, it's easier to get that parry timing that covers multiple attack timings from your opponent, and you still have access, especially for characters like Hugo, to things like SPD, right? So even though there is some downside to them having a bigger body, it's still very much applicable by forcing specific timings to be the only things that can interact. Hugo isn't the same as other characters. and most of the other characters in the game obviously aren't his stature, right? So when you are crouching next to Ken, you're basically the same height as him. So while this tech isn't Chun-Li specific, it's a lot harder for the bigger body characters. And this is where the other option selects of parry block and block parry block become a little bit more important. Because in this case, Ken can do early jump roundhouse or an early jump roundhouse timing against other characters where the active frames will still hit me because I'm crouching, because of how it would interact with the other characters, right? So in this case, I have to parry at a very specific timing, and it's not going to be consistent with the second timing, right? So if I want to try to parry this, and I want to try to parry the early jump, I have to parry block and hope for the best, or block parry, right? So that I can follow up. And because of this fundamental difference, you can still do the same thing against mid timing and late timing as Hugo, but the early jump timing just messes with you a little bit too much. So Q is not the same as Hugo. While Hugo has some problems, Q gets to do similar things. In this case, I'm able to crouch the early jump roundhouse just like every other character, right? And because I'm a little bit taller, I can force that parry if I really want to. But when you are trying to do it a bit later, this also is consistent, and it allows you to get your punishes. Obviously, you're not going to have many options against a very late jump roundhouse against Ken, because all of your moves have quite a bit of startup. Right? So even your best close normal starts up in 7 frames, active on frame 8. So the only thing that Q really has is throw, which is kind of crappy. So it's important to understand when you are jumping in at Q, like what his options still are if you're able to get safe jumps. Because this is one of the important aspects of dealing with Q, and also understanding how to deal with his anti-air game as well, right? But parry specifically, this tech does work for him. Urien is basically the same thing as Q. His height is basically the same as far as getting your parries and stuff, right? So, same sort of thing. The problem is, you don't really get good punishes. EX Aegis is sort of your only thing. Even from mid-jump timing, doing crouching HP doesn't work. So all of his punishes and stuff are contingent on the opponent doing a bit earlier attacks rather than later, if they're jumping forward, obviously. And then also depends on if the opponent is doing safe jump stuff or not in their face for characters like twins and stuff, doing neutral jump HK at specific timings. So even though this is very possible for Urien, he doesn't really get much from it outside of the fact that he can force the throw, or force the neutral scenario when Ken's able to potentially tech the throw, right? From a true safe jump or whatever. So it makes it a weird situation for him, but it does still work. The only thing that doesn't work is being able to late dash under Ken, but as long as you react in the first half of the jump, you are fine. But if you do it in the second half of the jump at all, you're just going to end up getting hit, right? Because you're too tall. So this is something to keep in mind as well. TLDR is very simple. Block, wait as long as humanly possible during the opponent's jump to do anything, parry at the last second. From here, you can do jump tech like MOV or Kuroda, or you can simply just jump. So you would parry and then jump away. Or alternatively, parry and then block. So this deals with mid-jump timings, and it also deals with safe jump timings. Now, why this is important is because depending on the situation, you need to be using a normal that will hit the opponent as they are landing into it. And it also needs to be startup of 3 frames or less. So it needs to hit on frame 4. So it's a lot easier to deal with the safe jump as Yun withstanding like Kick Dash Punch, or with Yang withstanding like EX Rekka. Hugo can do something like SPD or something, right? But realistically, you are doing this in order to cover multiple options so that you don't have to rely on parry guard or block parry block or any of these other sort of option selects, which are much more commonly used.